Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer calls the move a no-brainer, and he's encouraging the House and Trump administration to follow suit.
So you have a report there that's from Salem News talking about this resolution to ban members and staff from betting on prediction markets. Are they betting on? Is this happening? Of course, we hear a lot about insider trading from what seems to be both sides of the aisle as well. But what's this all about? Let's go to the expert on the issue, of course. Chad Pergram joins us once again, Chief Congressional Correspondent for Fox News. Chad, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you as well. Talk to me a little bit about this resolution regarding betting on prediction markets. Is this a preemptive strike here by the Senate, or is this something that's been known to happen?
Well, there's been a lot of conjecture that there were different accounts in Kalshi or Polymarket where people had wagered and made lots of money about, say, what was going to happen with Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, or when or if we were going to strike Iran, and the idea that if you were in government, or you were in the intelligence community, or you work in the Senate or something like that, you might have some information available to you or the administration that you can say, this is going to happen. Let me put a bet on this. And, we just don't bet on stocks anymore. A stock
everything
is a bet. We'll get to that. This is the idea that you're wagering these things and on real world events. And there was even a candidate from Virginia who put some money in that he would jump into a race and then made money on the fact that he then jumped in to run for office. And so you also have this phenomena of market manipulation going on, because the people who potentially could benefit from the wager are the people who are influencing the way. If you are betting that you're going to get into a race and you're like, nobody knows, but I'm going to run for office, and then you make that wager and then you run for office, well, guess what? And there's no regulation of this in that sense. And so the same thing about, you could understand whether or not, this is the problem with some of the performance in college sports and things. You bet if a player is going to make a free throw or a second free throw or something.
Yeah.
How many fouls they're going to have. And so if you bet that, okay, this person's going to be confirmed, and we know that it's going to be unanimous, and this is just a hypothetical, meaning that, this person has wide bipartisan support, but they don't get 100 votes, they get 98. And that's the number that you pegged it to because you knew or somebody sat out deliberately. You see, you can manipulate this marketplace and so this is where the Senate, and this was bipartisan, all 100 senators agreed to this. This was driven by Bernie Moreno, the Republican senator from Ohio, and Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader. As he put it, he said, we don't want to turn the Senate into a casino.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to turn it into a casino. I know there's a lot of questions surrounding, of course, Nancy Pelosi is the lead name on the insider trading portion of all of this. So it doesn't.
And that's completely different. And that's something that they have struggled with for decades.
What's the
and
struggle?
You're right.
Like, how is it a struggle?
Because, I asked that very question yesterday. I asked James Walkinshaw, who's a Democrat from Virginia, and he says, his thesis was, I think people just like to make trades. He said, I don't understand it, why they're doing this. Rob Bresnahan, who is a Republican representative from Pennsylvania, had said he was against the trades, but had made a lot of trades. And in the case of Nancy Pelosi, she got some criticism because she and her husband, and this is mostly done by her husband, but when she was the Speaker of the House, and this is well documented, that they traded a lot. Mm-hmm. They were just active traders. But should you be doing that when you're a legislator, let alone the Speaker of the House? And there's a website out there that tracks that the performance of their holdings outperform the S&P 500. And so, again, and that's now we're a little bit of apples and oranges here, because they have tried to pass the stock trading ban for years. They've talked about this in the House. Pelosi, she got some criticism because even though she was for it publicly, she wasn't for this particular version. And some people believe that that was her kind of way as Speaker sidelining that piece of legislation back when she was Speaker a few years ago. So, saying publicly you're for it. And that's the other thing. You talk to most members, and they say, yeah, I'm for it. I'm for banning it. But then the votes never seem to coalesce around a piece of legislation. Now, they passed something that was kind of an entry drug into barring this some years ago called the Stock Act. It was that's the abbreviation for it. But a lot of people don't think that went as far and think it was pretty easy to violate.
So, Chad Pergram speaking with us right now, chief congressional correspondent for Fox News. Is there a requirement if you're in Congress? Do you have to have some sort of blind investments where things are being traded, but you're not connected to them? Is there a rule or a regulation on that?
Well, you have to report that. That's the first thing, and so yes, and there are provisions where you have to put this in with the Federal Election Commission, but it's not as specific with staff and aides and people who might have some of that information. Now, the Stock Act that did pass in 2012, it requires that members of Congress and government employees report certain investment transactions within about 45 days of a trade. And, there was a report that there was something in the neighborhood, this is a few years ago, that up to 49 members and about 180 staffers had trades which violated the Stock Act, meaning they didn't report properly or there wasn't appropriate documentation. And what's funny is I went back, Annie, and President Obama, in his State of the Union address some years ago, he said, and Nancy Pelosi responded to this when she was the Speaker of the House, that he said, I want you guys to pass a resolution and I will sign it, banning, stock trades. Well, guess who said something very similar in his State of the Union this past February? President Trump. Here we are, 12, 14 years down the road, and this is still a problem. And I think what it comes down to is that there is a perception by the public, probably correct in some instances, that members of Congress and staff have access to information, which they do, but therefore should they be able to monetize that somehow? And it's just this whole interpretation that you have these people who are in the know, this certain class of people, and therefore they're able to somehow enrich themselves by access to that information. And they do so by holding public office and the public trust. And therein lies the rub.
So, I mean, there's a standard salary, right, for those who serve in the House and those who serve in the Senate. What are the other ways? Because there are a lot of people who go into Congress with a, respectable income, but they come out very wealthy. What are the other ways that they're doing that?
Well, that was the criticism of Nancy Pelosi. We've seen that with a couple of members, and I've done reporting of this over the winter and early this spring with Ilhan Omar, a Democratic representative from Minnesota, Ayanna Pressley, Democratic representative from Massachusetts, and both have gotten had made more money, according at least on paper, based on their financial disclosure reports through their relatives' financial disclosures of setting up consulting businesses or investments and things like that. So that's the one thing that you see, and again, some people are always wondering, and this is where Ilhan Omar in particular, there's an investigation by the House Oversight Committee. Was this done by the idea that you get, you have this status as a congresswoman? There are only 435. And even though this is done in your husband's name, now there's not stock trading with Ilhan Omar. The question is about her husband's consultancy and business. So the idea that you might be, you have this access suddenly because you're on Team Congress and might know more people and everything else, and therefore you benefit financially. And so, and the other, this is the other problem, is it speaks specifically to this, not necessarily the prediction markets or stock trades. The idea that they have to give these ranges of numbers, and that's where, in the case of, in particular with Omar, that it was they didn't have many assets, at least that they reported when they came to Congress, but then the number could be much higher, in the tens of millions, just a few years later. And their argument has been this doesn't really represent what we are worth because it's this range, and it's a pretty big range. And so some people have said, well, maybe we need to, tighten those numbers up a little bit so we have more specificity. And it's also a problem of how you value, say, an asset or something. So, yeah, I will say this. They're better about this than they were not that long ago, but it also exposes the potential for problems. And just the fact that everybody can go online now and look at what, some of these financial disclosure reports and FEC reports and everything else, and then say, aha, that looks a little funny. That used to take an awful lot of work, 20, 30 years ago or more. Now it's easy. And so that's why I think there's more scrutiny.
I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and before we let you go, we're speaking with Chad Pergram, the chief congressional correspondent for Fox News, on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. The investigation, as I understand it, correct me where I'm wrong, is that this is an investigation coming out of Minnesota. It's not coming from specifically within the House of Representatives. Is that correct?
Well, there's a couple of different things going on there. There is something that has been going on with the state house there. Okay, that there's been a fraud prevention committee in the state of Minnesota where they've been looking into this. And in fact, there was just a vote a few days ago on Tuesday where they failed, and this was the investigation in the state house, the Minnesota State House, that they did not approve a subpoena for some documents that they, wanted her to provide that she was refusing to provide. So, they were going to subpoena her. This is in the state legislature, these documents, and they didn't even have the votes to approve the subpoena. Now, here in Washington on Capitol Hill, and I asked this question of James Comer, the chairman of the Oversight Committee, a couple of months ago, because he was starting this inquiry by the Oversight Committee. That's usually not where these inquiries go. They go to the Ethics Committee. And so my question was, why was this before Comer's committee? Because I've never seen another committee investigate a member. If there's a question of conduct, that usually goes to the Ethics Committee. And he said, well, he said, we had gotten a blessing from the Ethics Committee to do this. And what they're looking at, and this is where it gets a little hairy, and this is where I brought up, spouses and family members and everything else. She is not directly under scrutiny. It's her husband. And so James Comer is saying we don't have access to him because he's not a member of the institution, just her. And so we can do this out, from the Oversight Committee rather than the Ethics Committee, which would adjudicate your own conduct if you were a member. That's like when, Sheila Sherfullis McCormick, the former representative from Florida, the Democrat, resigned just a couple of weeks ago. She's facing criminal charges and a trial in February in Florida. The Ethics Committee ended its, investigation. They were going to report out a punishment for her. There was a good chance that she was going to be expelled. But as soon as she resigned, which she did right before basically the punishment hearing, they're done because they don't have access to a former member of Congress.
It's a little bit like the Matt Gaetz situation, right? Didn't he resign right before? Did he bomb out before the Ethics Committee just came to fruition completely?
There was a question about that, there was an inquiry and whether or not he stepped out just before they could get their hands on him. There was also the question about him being, he'd run for re-election and had not even been sworn into the new term. This is in the fall of 2024, and then resigned without taking office, and even told the clerk of the House that he would not be seated, and so because he was not going to be a member anymore. And of course, remember, he had been picked to be Attorney General for President Trump.
Yeah.
And that only lasted a few days as well. So, there's some debate around here about people leaving before maybe some ethics issue comes down the pike. Some years ago, Rob Andrews was a Democratic representative from New Jersey. There were some questions related to his family and his ethics, and then he resigned. He took another position. Now, sometimes that's by design, but it's very hard to prove these things, and I think that's by design for the institution. And to be frank with you, Annie, that cuts two ways too. Yes, these members, because they are our representatives and senators, deserve a lot of scrutiny, but it's also the idea that everybody's out to get them because there's always politics involved, and so reporting on it is very challenging because somebody can make an allegation about somebody or say, well, look what they've done here, blah blah blah. And you're like, okay, are they just throwing mud at them because they're from the other party, or they don't like them, or they want to get them in trouble? And so you have to be very careful. And so that's part of the reason why some of these rules can be a little bit obtuse sometimes to protect the members. Otherwise, that's all you would have. What they did. This is about 20 years ago. You had the Jack Abramoff scandal, and I've covered ethics issues in Congress for a long time now. But Jack Abramoff, was the super lobbyist here in Washington. There were questions about whether or not, there were ties with, Bob Ney, who was a Republican congressman from Ohio, who actually went to jail. Questions about Tom DeLay, who at the time had been the majority leader, who left under a cloud. He resigned. And so the Democrats were coming into office. And so part of that was, was we're going to clean up Washington. That was part of the reason why they won the election in 2006 and won back control of the House. And so Nancy Pelosi is going to be the new speaker. And so they created, and there's some merit in this, but there's a downside, what they called the Office of Congressional Ethics, which is different from the Ethics Committee. And what it meant, and this was the good side of it, is that anybody could say, oh, we have a credible allegation here about somebody. Here's this information, and send it to the Office of Congressional Ethics, and they could look at it. And then if they think there was there, send it on to the Ethics Committee. The downside of it is that somebody could send anything in, and they would look at it. And there was almost a cottage industry here because people did not distinguish between the Office of Congressional Ethics, which was this semi-public, and the actual Ethics Committee, and then you would see these press releases. There's an investigation. There's an ethics investigation. Well, just because you sent in your paper and alleged about Congressman so-and-so, you see. So they've changed that. They don't have the Office of Congressional Ethics. Is the Office of Congressional Conduct is what it is. And so there's a similar process, but some different guardrails now. And they still can send something over to the Ethics Committee. But you see how, on one hand, that might have helped, address ethics in Congress, but also exposed people another way. Because if you looked at somebody wrong or you had a political enemy, I'd be shocked that people in this building have political enemies. Well, guess what? They were going to come at you.
Yeah. And the justice that is served is often in the way we do it in a democratic republic at the ballot box. So people can be discerning. Voters need to be discerning in and of themselves to vet these issues once they get out and smeared or exposed, whichever one it might actually be. Chad Pergram, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show with us. Thank you for being with us today. We look forward to having you back soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.